Barnett-Oksenberg Lecture on Sino-American Relations. My name is Paul Liu. I'm head of the organizing committee. And so let me say a few words at the outset to introduce the lecture. The lecture is founded with the view that the open and frank dialogue between the U.S. and China is critical. And the lecture is designed to provide a forum every year where issues in the relationship which have arisen in the past year or which are anticipated to happen will be discussed frankly and honestly. The lecture is named in honor of the late A. Barnett and the late Michael Oksenberg, both American scholars and policymakers of distinction, whose writings and actions had a major impact on bilateral relations dating back to the 1960s. Barnett was born and raised in Shanghai and was one of the few academic voices in the 1960s calling for a relationship with China despite the deep differences between the two nations at that time. Was Barnett's distinguished student and continued their intellectual line of thinking, eventually serving in the Carter administration's National Security Council and playing a key role in the normalization of relations between the two countries and their leaders. Both Doak and Mike shared a love of China and its people while not letting this affect their ability for critical and objective analysis and long-term vision. I had the privilege of studying under both Doak and Mike, and tonight we once again gather to honor them and their contributions to the bilateral relationship. Doak and Mike were men of vision who saw past obstacles and differences and worked for a realistic yet harmonious relationship, something which we all hope for, especially now and in the coming year, which may prove to be difficult. Each year we chose to have a lecture here at the Jinjiang Auditorium for its symbolism, for it's on this spot that President Nixon and Premier Zhou Enlai signed the seminal document in U.S. China Relations, the Shanghai Communique. And we sit here in Shanghai, China's premier business city, and a commercial engine for the expanding relationship between our two great nations. We are very honored today to have as our speaker the Honorable Ambassador Carla A. Our moderator, Ding Xinghao, will introduce Ambassador Hill shortly. We would like to thank the Shanghai Office of Foreign Affairs for supporting this event, as well as our sponsors whose generosity made this event possible. And we would also like to thank in particular the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai for helping to organize this event. So thank you all once again for coming and enjoy the lecture.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor to welcome Ambassador Association for American Studies. This Barnett-Oksenberg Lecture on Sino-U.S. Relations has been already set for 5 years. And during the 5 years, we have seen a great change of the world and in the two countries. And this year, we are facing a very special and challenging year for our bilateral relation. So Ambassador Hill's coming and giving lecture will give us very insight and profound analysis of our bilateral relation. I believe her speech will provoke a very interesting discussion and make us mutual understanding deeper. So I just say these words and thank you, Ambassador Hughes, for your coming and for your very profound lecture. Thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Jan Barris. I'm the Vice President of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and I'm delighted to be here today on the American Association. We are very honored to be part of this event, particularly because both Doak Barnett and Mike Oksenberg were very active and involved in our organization. In fact, Doak was one of our founding members and our second chairman. And Mike was also extremely active in the organization. Now usually, when I come for this lecture every year, I get to take, well this year, let me start this way. This year, I've been very privileged to bring along with me, or to be traveling with, a wonderful lady who you will soon meet. In the past 4 times that we've had this lecture, I've also been privileged to travel with 2 wonderful ladies. And unfortunately, neither of them can be here today. One is Jean Barnett, the widow of Doak, and the other is Lois Oksenberg. Jean and Lois were really so very sorry they couldn't be here, but they asked me if I would read something on their behalf. So that's what I'm going to do, and this is from the 2 of them. It is with great regret and disappointment that our circumstances this year have not permitted us to be present at the 5th annual Barnett-Oksenberg Lecture on Sino-American Relations. We were deeply honored and privileged to participate in the previous 4 lectures and enjoyed immensely meeting and talking with both Chinese and American attendees, greeting with delight each year old friends and making new friends. Although we are not China scholars ourselves, each of us has traveled widely and many times to and around China and are strong personal stakeholders in these 2 countries. We strongly affirm this people-to-people annual event, the symbolism of its setting right here in Shanghai, at the very site of the signing of the Shanghai Communique. And we also deeply honor and respect what the Barnett-Oksenberg Lecture represents in terms of the future of these 2 giants on either side of the Pacific. So on their behalf, I want to thank all of you. And I do want to mention, although Jean couldn't be here today, Doak's nephew, James Barnett, is in the audience. James, why don't you stand so that people can see you? And those of you who know those of you who had the privilege of knowing Doak, if you look at James, you can just see the family resemblance. It's really wonderful. And I know Doak would be very proud of the fact that James is here today carrying on their great family tradition. This is what the 3rd generation of Barnetts who lived and worked in China. And I know that also Doak and Mike would be very, very proud of this event that we've instituted, and I know they're here with us in spirit. So thank you again.
A lecture, and it is even more my pleasure and honor to make a few introductory remarks. She is something like 3 in 1. What is 3 in 1? She starts with her career as a business leader, then got into the Bush administration as a cabinet member and did as, I don't know, as the U.S. Then she is the leader and the head of different organizations, think tanks. So she is a business leader and ex-government official as well as distinguished scholars. So I don't need to repeat what the program says. The other thing is Carla Hughes is Chinese, is a long-time good friend of China and the Chinese people. One thing I want to mention is when our relationship in mid-90s, after the first term of Bush administration, this relationship looks like drifting, don't know where to go. Both the leaders of both China and the United States and the political elite, many in China very much frustrated. I was visiting the United States, Washington in 1996, 1997. You all know the political atmosphere in Washington is not very positive, not very happy to both the political elite in China and the United States. At that time, Carla Hughes and his colleague lead a workshop in Council on Foreign Relations. Last night I picked out a book. This is done by under the leadership of Carla Hughes and Dennis Blair. I think Richard has mailed me this book, and I read carefully. I must say, Ambassador Hughes made a great contribution to put our relationship back to the track. So the title of this is U.S. China Relations and Affirmative Agenda, a Responsible Course. So after the many, which received very warm response from the audience, both in the United States and China. So you can see how important and influential she is, and how she has made contributions to our U.S.-China relations. Now, let's have Ambassador Hughes have his to talk.
Thank you for your very warm words, Professor Zhang. For the 5th Barnett-Oksenberg Memorial Lecture. It was jointly sponsored by the Shanghai Association of American Studies and the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. I'd like to thank a number of organizations and special individuals who have made this wonderful event possible. First of all, the organizations and the list of sponsors that you see listed behind me, and also in your brochure. Paul Liu, who has been absolutely wonderful in initiating this lecture. He was the spark who initiated it in honor of Doak Barnett and Mike Oksenberg, 2 teachers who were meaning a great deal to him, and Professor Ding Xinghao for your work, along with Paul Liu and Jan Barris, for coordinating all these administrative details, and Professor Zhang Yuan for his participation, and finally the American Chamber of Commerce of Shanghai for its magnificent logistical assistance. You know, I had the enormous pleasure of knowing both Professors Barnett and Oksenberg, who are acknowledged to be 2 of America's finest China scholars. In the 80s, when Doak Barnett was a scholar at the Brookings Institution, I served as a member of the Brookings Board of Trustees, and I was very impressed with his book, China Economy and the Global Perspective, published by Brookings. And in the early 90s, we crossed paths often at meetings of the National Committee of the U.S. China Relations, and where he was the organizational member and served as a chairman. No question about it. His knowledge of China was deep and broad, as was his generosity of spirit. And Michael Oksenberg and I became friends while serving as board members of the National Committee and attending events of the Council of Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission. His humor and grace made him loved by all who knew him, and many of the observations that he made in his book, Shaping U.S.-China Relations, a Long-Term Strategy, could be usefully applied today. Both men moved easily in the worlds of academe and policy. During his lifetime, beginning with President Lyndon Johnson, Doak advised every administration about China and the importance of establishing and maintaining a strong bilateral relationship. He is believed by many to have been one of the voices influencing President Nixon to make the overtures to China that led to the signing of the 1972 Shanghai Communique and paved the way for restoring diplomatic relations. And Mike served as in the National Security Administration under the big Brzezinski in the Carter administration, and was a member of the delegation that traveled to China for the signing of the joint communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations on January 1, 1979. Both men believed in comprehensive engagement and urged patience and understanding in pursuing solutions to tough problems. In the intervening years, the Sino-American relationship has broadened and deepened in ways that few would have imagined in those early years. However, all of us who care deeply about the bilateral relationship are concerned by the unexpected frictions that have surfaced in recent months. Some of the friction is a natural result of the fact that the relatively clear-cut bipolar challenges of the Cold War have been replaced by new, complex, 21st century transnational challenges: nuclear proliferation, pandemics, terrorism, drug trafficking, and climate change, and involve many, many more players. But of the political pressures and the competing interests driving the other side, that makes it more difficult to figure out how to bridge our policy differences. We need to talk more to achieve a better understanding. China has become much stronger economically, geopolitically, and militarily. For 3 decades, it has averaged double-digit growth. Last year, in the midst of a global recession, China grew close to 9%, maintaining its position as the world's fastest growing economy. This year, China is likely to replace Japan as the world's second largest economy and its largest trading nation. Increasingly, the questions are raised: can the world's biggest and the fastest growing economies constructively work together to enhance our future prosperity and stability? Or have our increasingly competitive economies, along with the differences in our histories, forms of government, and domestic sensitivities, become too great to enable us to harness our respective strengths to deal effectively with today's bilateral and global challenges? Like the men we honor here tonight, I am an optimist. I believe we can, should, and must work constructively together, and more importantly, I believe that by doing so, we can build habits of cooperation that will help us deal effectively with the new challenges as they arise, which will not only enhance the well-being of the people of China and the people of the United States, but will contribute meaningfully to global peace and stability. Initially, when I was invited to speak, given my interests and my background, I intended to focus my remarks on economic challenges and opportunities affecting our relationship, rather than foreign policy and strategic issues. But the disagreements that have arisen recently over basic foreign policy issues inevitably affect how we deal with economic issues. And for that reason, I have broadened the focus of my remarks. I have been advised to be candid, so I will be, in order to explain why I believe that it is important for both sides to take steps to moderate these frictions. Let me start by assessing the policy differences that have existed over a number of years and recently have become more rancorous. Take the February 2nd announcement that President Obama would meet with the Dalai Lama, a decision that was communicated to the Chinese leadership before the announcement. Every sitting U.S. president over the past 2 decades has met with the Dalai Lama. China has consistently expressed its disapproval, but Americans were, quite frankly, astonished by China's unprecedented level of anger over President Obama's scheduled meeting. Our differing views of the meeting are undoubtedly shaped by our differing values, cultures, and politics. For the Chinese, the Dalai Lama symbolizes the tensions in Tibet that it sees as a challenge to its national sovereignty and its unity. For the Americans, the Dalai Lama is a respected international religious leader. When presidents meet unofficially with such individuals, the meeting symbolizes the religious openness that is so basic to our culture. A refusal to meet would have subjected President Obama to harsh criticism from Americans of all political persuasions. Again, last month, the announced arms sales by the United States to Taiwan generated an outburst of anger by China that took most Americans by surprise. Every administration since 1979, when we normalized U.S. China Relations, has sold arms to Taiwan pursuant to the Taiwan Relations Act, which was signed just 4 months after our two governments normalized their diplomatic relations. In that act, our Congress required the United States to provide Taiwan with arms of a defensive character. As with the meeting with the Dalai Lama, the Obama administration advised China, before it was publicly announced, that it would implement an arms sale agreement. It was actually negotiated in 2008 to sell $6.4 billion of arms to Taiwan, which included interceptor missiles, helicopters, and communications equipment, but did not include the F-16s that had been requested. The President would have paid a very high political cost had he refused to move forward with this agreement. Now, in its anger, China threatened sanctions against the companies selling the equipment and the withdrawal of cooperation on international issues. In my view, it was especially regrettable that it also suspended planned high-level military exchanges and postponed the agreed visits later this year by the U.S. Defense Secretary Bob Gates, as well as scheduled talks between Chen Pengdi, the Chinese People Liberation Army's Chief of General Staff, and Admiral Michael Mullins, the Chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. Where our two governments have disagreements over matters of defense, it is particularly important for our military leaders to meet and to discuss those differences. That is not happening today. A habit of regularly holding such meetings might well have moderated the rancor over the arms sale to Taiwan. Most experts, Chinese and American, believe that trust between our military forces is much lower than exists in other areas of our relationship. The number and level of joint military exchanges lags far behind the number and level of exchanges our two governments have established to discuss economic and other policy issues. The weakness of our military relationship was acknowledged at the July Strategic and Economic Dialogue where both sides agreed that additional such exchanges should take place. It was again recognized during the Obama-WHO meeting this past November, where the two presidents agreed in a joint statement to actively implement various military exchanges, increasing the level and frequency to foster greater understanding of each other's intentions environment. Now, our military leaders may continue to disagree on issues, but regular and candid face-to-face discussion could help explain the reasons for the actions taken by each side, reduce the possibilities for miscalculation, and provide a forum in which to resolve misunderstandings. Military dialogue. Bring our military leaders together on a regular basis to talk about issues like Taiwan, and there are others. In that case, perhaps they might reach an agreement that would see the Chinese reducing or pulling back the number of missiles in Fujian that are pointed at Taiwan, and the Americans reducing or downgrading future sales of defensive weapons to Taiwan. As a policy backdrop, one cannot help but notice and be pleased that in recent years, Taiwan and China have built a much stronger economic bond. President Ma Ying-jeou has been a pervasive voice for increasing social and economic interactions across the strait. He has been an advocate for the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, which would reduce bilateral tariffs and increase trade opportunities between Taiwan and the mainland. He has also sought to reduce domestic political friction with his declaration of no independence, no unification, and no use of force. Some Americans who closely study Taiwan politics believe that had the United States reneged on the arms sales agreement, the fact would have been used against President Ma by his political opponents and continue to agitate for independence. And the United States and China both share an interest in a harmonious cross-strait relations that President Ma supports. With regularly held dialogues, our military leaders could share their assessments of the political setting in which decisions involving defense by both sides are made. To withdraw cooperation with respect to unrelated international issues such as the development of nuclear weapons in North Korea and Iran. Although neither the United States nor China want North Korea or Iran to become the nuclear powers, China assesses both threats as lower than does the United States. Our different assessments of the risk further underscore the need for and the value of increasing the number and frequency of joint military dialogue. With respect to North Korea, it is well known that it has developed and tested a nuclear bomb. It has built a nuclear reactor in Syria, and it has sent component chemicals to Libya. Many defense experts in the United States believe that North Korea's greatest threat is its willingness to export nuclear bombs, material, or technology for cash. China is best situated to discover any attempt by North Korea to ship a nuclear product to the Middle East, which would create a major global risk. To reduce that risk, our governments should be working together with Japan, Russia, and South Korea, members of the six-party talks, to obtain North Korea's agreement to what has been called the three no's. No export of nuclear weapons or materials, no building of additional bombs, and no more testing, which could advance North Korea's ability to build a more sophisticated bomb. The international community, including the United States, is also highly concerned about Iran's nuclear enrichment program. Iran claims that it's enriching uranium for fuel, but has failed to respond to proposals from the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, which includes both China and the United States, to swap Iran's low-enriched uranium for processed nuclear fuel. Iran's development of a nuclear weapon would be enormously destabilizing in the Middle East. Cooperation between our two governments and our respective militaries to limit the nuclear ambitions of North Korea and Iran is not a favor that China grants to the United States, but rather a global challenge that must be met with global leadership. And I'm concerned that China's highly publicized threat to refuse to cooperate with the United States to find solutions to global challenges because of unresolved bilateral disputes put at risk not only China's reputation as a global problem solver, but also the world's prospect for future peace and stability. We will continue to have strategic and foreign policy issues where we do not agree, but we should talk about them candidly, listen carefully, and try hard to bridge the gaps. And that applies as well to economic issues. We share interests in a number of serious economic challenges, 2 of the most critical today being the need to rebalance the global economy and the need to keep global markets open in the face of mounting economic nationalism. Take the enormous problem created by the serious imbalance in the global economy. It has grown over the past years, a decade or so, because Germany, Japan, China, and other Asian economies have built their growth on export, whereas the United States, United Kingdom, and Spain have relied excessively on domestic consumption, particularly in the housing sector, to fuel their economic growth. And although investment excesses in the financial sector triggered the financial crisis in 2008, there is general agreement that the global imbalance made the crisis much, much worse. As stated last year by Gerald Corrigan, former president of the New York Federal Reserve, it is highly likely that these imbalances would create a serious macroeconomic problem even if we had not had the fiscal problem. If we are to protect against future global financial crises, the global economy must be brought into better balance. And that will require debtor and creditor nations to alter their existing economic models to put their economies on a more sustainable growth plan. Debtor nations cannot continue to consume at excessive levels as in the past, and creditor nations must look more to their own consumers to fuel their economic growth. That means the United States must stop its consumption binge and reduce its soaring deficit fueled by excessive government and household spending. And China will need to reduce its reliance on exports and investments, particularly in heavy industry, as its principal sources of economic growth. A commitment by the United States to undertake the structural reforms necessary to achieve more balanced growth is not a favor granted to China, nor is a decision by China to stimulate domestic consumption a favor granted to the United States. The policy corrections that each needs to make are necessary to ensure each nation's future financial stability and prosperity. For if the corrections are not made, the global imbalance will likely ignite another economic crisis in the future. Global balance is more likely to be restored if the world's largest debtor nation and its largest surplus nation take the lead in implementing corrective measures. While necessary, these changes will not be politically popular. But having the United States and China take corrective action in a similar time frame is likely to reduce the political friction in both countries. We all know that the necessary policy changes cannot be implemented overnight. That if each of our governments were to commit to specific structural reform and spell out the specific steps that each would take with time frames where appropriate and provide periodic updates regarding their progress, perhaps at meetings of the G20, that would boost confidence in the future health and prosperity of the global market, which in turn would help keep our respective domestic economies on a sustainable growth path. In the United States, that means that both the public and the private sectors will have to curtail their spending and increase their savings. In response to the crisis, the private sector has increased its savings by roughly 5%. But the federal government's budget has grown by 5%, thus offsetting the increase in private saving. Going forward, the U.S. government needs to commit to bring its primary budget into balance in a specified period of time, say 5 years, and its overall deficit into balance in a specified period of time, say 10 years. And it must reinstitute the pay-as-you-go program enforced by a process that limits future unfunded spending and requires any gaps to be filled by tax initiatives. It will also need to restructure an entitlement program like Social Security to take account of longer lifespans. The political response to these changes will be highly unpopular, but it will protect Americans from what could be an even more serious recession down the road. And going forward, China's government has a number of policy instruments to encourage an increase in domestic consumption to fuel its future economic growth. As Drs. Lardy and Goldstein document in their well-written study entitled The Future of China's Exchange Rate Policy, fiscal, financial, exchange rate, and price are 4 policy instruments that China could use to reduce the preference given to large companies, particularly state-owned companies, that invest in heavy industry and manufactured goods for export. For example, correcting China's underpricing of land, energy, capital, and water would discourage excessive investment in heavy industries like aluminum, iron, steel, cement that rely upon those production factors. More equitable pricing of those factors, particularly capital, would encourage the development of small and medium-sized enterprises that are the backbone of job creation, which in turn would help moderate the wage gap between the urban and rural workers. And using fiscal, financial, exchange rate, and price instruments to reduce China's reliance on heavy industry and export is likely to be opposed by those interests who benefit from the system as it is. but changing the system would greatly benefit the Chinese people. Yet many in China are unaware of what is at stake. It is a surprise to many Chinese that its top 5 heavy industries are the most energy intensive, using over 40% of China's energy demand and creating most of the pollution, and yet employ fewer than 2% of China's workforce. According to the 2006 report of China's Environmental Protection Agency, the cost of environmental degradation cost China between 8 and 13% of its GDP, costs 750,000 lives each year, and is responsible for China's chronic shortage of clean water and has resulted in soil pollution by heavy metals that have destroyed thousands of acres of arable farmland. In short, our two governments, by taking on this challenge to rebalance their respective economies, could turn it into an opportunity to deliver very substantial benefits to their respective populations. Also, they would gain the additional benefit of helping to correct the global imbalance, a major factor in creating the Great Recession, and thus help to ensure people against future economic turmoil. We cannot forget that in the 1930s, the worldwide depression resulted from a toxic combination of a severe global economic imbalance and a near universal increase in trade barriers. Keeping our bilateral markets open while working to further open global markets is a challenge that, if addressed seriously, would enhance the growth of our domestic economies while contributing to the expansion and stability of the global economy. As headlines in our respective newspapers document, bilateral trade disputes have multiplied over the past 6 months. The United States has taken action to restrict the imports of Chinese tires, steel pipe, magazine quality paper, various salts, while China has moved to restrict U.S. movies and books, poultry, auto parts, nylon, industrial assets, and threatened to commence an investigation of U.S. passenger cars. These actions are not helpful. At each of the G20 meetings, the assembled leaders pledged not to erect barriers to imports, not to violate the WTO rules, and not to impose export restrictions. Yet the report published last September by Global Trade Alert documents that the G20 members have put in place over 120 blatantly discriminatory trade measures, and that nearly that many are in the pipeline. The United States and China are among the offenders. While this sort of protectionism will not be stopped by pledges, whether at the G20 meeting or any other meeting, it could be stopped if our two governments took the lead at the upcoming G20 meeting to press for a real commitment to carry out the leaders' promise to keep their markets open and themselves set an example. In addition, the United States and China could work together to push the Doha round to a successful conclusion, and so doing create new and exciting opportunities for Chinese and American entrepreneurs while giving the global economy a real boost. According to studies conducted at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, tariff cuts for agriculture and industrial goods, $100 billion a year, and we need that growth now. Open markets make a difference. It is thanks to open markets that China has averaged double-digit growth for the past 3 decades and created the jobs necessary to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Economic nationalism. When unemployment is high, public pressure escalates to raise protective barriers against incoming goods, services, and investment. And we need to resist those pressures, for we know that they will decrease economic opportunity and increase hostility. A successful resistance will require all of us to make a concerted effort to educate our population, our fellow citizens, on how opening markets stimulates economic growth, creates opportunity, and enhances global stability. Too few people in both the United States and China appreciate the extent to which legal and regulatory barriers limit development and creative endeavor. They need to hear from our leaders in government, universities, think tanks, businesses, groups represented here this afternoon, how keeping domestic and global markets open is critical to their future prosperity. For all these issues that China and the United States face today, whether foreign policy, military, or economic, is overwhelmingly in our national interest to maintain a close, candid, collaborative, constructive relationship. As President Obama has said, the relationship between the United States and China will shape the 21st century. Through engagement, we are more likely to find solutions to our differences and turn our challenges into opportunities. We know that high-level engagement works. Between 2006 and 2008, cabinet officials from both of our governments met 2 days, twice a year, in what was called the Strategic Economic Dialogue. The goal was to discuss complex, long-standing economic challenges and to craft solutions satisfactory to both governments. Since both of our governments are quite compartmentalized and have different organizational structures, these meetings brought together the relevant high-level officials on both sides to talk about critical issues. And these face-to-face meetings enabled both sides to better understand the concerns of their counterparts and led to a number of positive outcomes. Importantly, such meetings help to avoid having to initiate talks among strangers in the heat of a crisis. In 2009, the Obama administration broadened the economic dialogue to cover strategic as well as economic issues. And last July's 2-day meeting showed that the newly formed strategic and economic dialogue to be an effective forum for raising and discussing issues of mutual concern. Next meeting will be held in late May or early June. My personal view is that the strategic and economic dialogue should be held more frequently than every 10 to 11 months, particularly now that the agenda is broader, challenges are greater, and there are more participants. There is no substitute for face-to-face meetings to increase understanding, and relationships matter. Both Doak Barnett and Mike Oksenberg believed in engagement. As they said, it requires patience and understanding. And our two great nations working together could shape history in a very positive way by making the tough decisions today that would ensure international peace and prosperity and a better life for our people tomorrow. We will continue to have our differences, but let us recall the Chinese proverb: unless there is an opposing wind, the kite cannot rise. Thank you.
Let me introduce you Professor Zhang Yuwen. He's Director of World Economy, SAS, and also Chairman of World Economy Academy. He is in Shanghai. People call him Shanghai's Nicholas Lady, if not China's Nicholas Lady. He is an expert on U.S. China relations.
Thank you. 尊敬的U.S Stars 女士们、先生们，我非常荣幸被邀请在今天这个会议上对U.S Stars 的演讲谈些体会。 特别是对中美关系在当代世界经济当中、当代世界当中它的重要性所做的评价是正确的。第二，我体会大使的演讲具有重要价值，是直接的针对了中美双方共同关系的问题，指出了中美双方缺乏理解，应当为政策弥补差距、弥补差异。 或者说，在英文当中，那就是为差距搭建桥梁，需要更多的以交流来增进理解。大使强调，两个国家应当更多的接触和对话，这是完全正确的。今天大使这样的演讲，正是这样一种有益的、可以增进理解的这样一种交流。那么我们知道，今天也正好是两位重要的白宫客人前来北京访问，进行这种交流。 那么，在中美关系出现了不利局面，这个时候能够进行这样一种比较客观的学术分析，是完全有益的。第三，我完全同意 U.S Stars 在他演讲的第一部分的最后所说的话。他说，中美两国将继续会在战略与外交问题上不相一致，但是。 我们就这些问题进行坦诚的对话，细心的听取对方的意见。我们看到，可惜的是，奥巴马政府没有能够听取中国方面在事先的一再提醒，使得对台军售、汇进达量这样一类事情接连发生。这些问题都明显的涉及了中国的国家的核心利益。 常识告诉我们，外交问题关系到一个国家的整体利益，它在优先的顺序上，应当是超越一个国家国内某一集团利益。这个演讲当中感到启发的和值得注意的几个观点：第一，关于全球经济的不平衡问题。 大使从中国国内发展战略政策上提出了要改变过度依赖于外部市场和对外不平衡问题，是有启发的和引人深思的。大使正确的提出了中美两国经济增长战略的调整，会有利于两个国家，也有利于世界各国，指出了两个大国国内发展模式的国际影响，也是有启示。 当然，我也认为，中美两国并不是世界不平衡的全部来源，而只是代表了世界的两种发展模式、发展典型。因为其他国家在不同程度上也是这样，就是对外的贸易不平衡。第二个问题，那就是关于中国发展战略调整问题。我完全同意大使所说的。 中国应当扩大内需，用财政、金融、汇率和价格四种政策工具去减少对投资这个重工业公司和制造业产品出口这样一种优惠。中国能源的高消耗和这个发展 所导致的污染问题确实是非常严重。这些中国的持续增长，这些问题对中国的持续增长是非常重要的。那么事实上，前几年中国也已经开始了发展战略的重大的调整，但是金融危机中断了，在一定程度上影响了这样的进程。保就业、保增长成为最大主题。我们有理由相信，中国所提出的这样一些目标，在抵御危机当中转变发展方式这样目标，今后几年会有新的成长。第三个问题，我想提出几个问题，请教于大使，与各位共同的探讨。大使虽然只讲了全球不平衡和贸易保护这两大问题，但实际上涉及了当代国际经济、中国经济大量问题或者主要问题。首先，第一点，关于世界经济的不平衡问题。当代世界经济的不平衡，我认为跟上一个世纪30年代是有区别的。表面上来看是贸易的不平衡，但实际上是由全球的生产转移所造成的。30年代并不是这样。那么中国的出口当中包含了美国以及其他国家的中间产品，包括了在中国投资者的收益，只有一小部分是中国自己的工资收入和土地的收入。也就是说，不能把中国的全部出口收益看作为中国的收入，所有各国都在中国获得收益，这是中国今天贸易的性质。与此同时，中美两国对外经济关系的不平衡问题也值得我们关注。中国的巨额的贸易顺差、巨额的外汇储备，被看作为是这场危机的原因之一，只是缺乏理论基础，是基于过时的理论所得出的结论。因为今天我们是经济全球化的时代，经济全球化的最重要特征是什么呢？那就是国际的资本流动、产业的转移，从而贸易的流向出现大的调整。从长期来看，中美两国这样一种模式是不可持续的，也就是说，严重的对外不平衡。如果中国长期不能有效地使用出口盈余、进口先进设备，提升产业结构，而是继续的靠廉价劳动力出口低端产品，那么中国的发展将长期是低水平，世界市场将更加无法承受中国的出口，中国自己的发展也是不可持续的。中国的出口收入、外汇的闲置会影响中国自身的发展，美国的国债不断上升更是不可持续的。那么我们如何来看这场危机的成因呢？今天我们不是要从责任上，而是要从学术上去探讨这个问题。中国的巨额贸易顺差，原因之一是中国缺乏有效的国内投资机制和能力，于是呢，就把外汇的基于购买了美国的国债。不论中国的外汇储备是采用了购买美国国债的形式，还是储蓄在国际银行的这样一种存款形式，如果美国的投资者把这些存款有效地运用实体经济，不出现过度的发展，那么也就不会导致这场金融危机。那么我们在生活当中可以这样一个比喻，在一般经济生活当中，一个靠工资收入的人，如果他不会投资，那么他就会把工资的结余存在银行，而另一个人从银行借了钱去进行投资，犯了错误，亏损了，或者他借了钱去赌博破产了，那么是不是储蓄的人要为投资赌博失败的人负责呢？作为新兴市场经济体的中国，长期的贸易顺差是当前发展阶段的一个必须的转变为中长期，当然不是永久性。一方面，新兴经济体通过引进外资， 以外贸拉动经济增长，这是一种基本的发展模式。另一方面，更重要的是，发达国家通过投资把制造基地放在新兴经济体当中，就必然会导致新兴经济体出口大大高于进口，特别是采用加工贸易的形式。与此对应的是，发达国家投资流出大大超过流入。我们必须指出，这些出口顺差当中包含了发达国家的巨大收益，而并不是全部是像中国这样新兴市场经济的收益。发达国家投资者在新兴经济体产权的扩大，本国公司货币收入的增长，美国的国债与新兴经济体的外贸顺差都有着客观原因，将是长期，当然不是永久，因为美国所承担了许多的国际事务，新兴市场经济体目前正处于引进外资、靠外贸创造就业这样的发展阶段，所以还会持续相当一个时期。最后一方面问题是关于市场开放问题，我非常赞同大使关于坚持开放市场、反对贸易保护主义的观点，增加机会和增强全球的稳定。中美两国应当率先承诺和开放市场。我非常赞同大使关于市场开放的主张。这里我不想分析中美贸易摩擦是否美国贸易保护主义的结果，但是我也很遗憾地说，在美国有另外一种声音，主张对中国搞贸易保护主义。更重要的是，这种言论来自于一位著名的美国经济学家，诺贝尔经济学奖获得者保罗·克鲁格曼。今年的元旦，克鲁格曼教授在《纽约时报》上发表了专栏文章《中国的新年》。所谓中国的新年，在克鲁格曼看来，是因为2010年世界的焦点将是因为中国追求出口顺差，所谓被他称为重商主义的这样一种贸易政策引起的世界贸易保护主义浪潮。一、中国对外贸易的结构与顺差的来源。克鲁格曼教授的基本观点是，其根本原因是人民币汇率低估。那么，如果我们具体分析一下中国的贸易结构和贸易顺差的来源，就可以发现这个结论是错误。中国的统计表明，我用10年的统计来更好地说明这个问题。从1999年到2008年10年当中，中国对外贸易总出口当中52.2%是加工贸易，47.8%是一般贸易。10年的贸易顺差总额是1万亿美元多一点，其中来自加工贸易的顺差总额是12500亿美元，而一般贸易呢是逆差，并不是顺差，总额是2500多亿美元。那么我们大家都知道，加工贸易的顺差是必然的，关键是汇率同时影响加工贸易的进出口。不管汇率水平怎么样，以国内增加值来创汇，这样一个加工贸易的基本特点，决定了加工贸易总是正常。要求加工贸易实现平衡，等于是说中国的国内工资为0，土地价格为0，那是不现实的。人民币汇率再怎么样升值，加工贸易永远是正常。相反，中国的一般贸易是逆差。如果要按照克鲁格曼的主张，那么中国不应当是让人民币升值，相反还应该贬值。第二个问题，关于中国的汇率水平和它对世界的利弊问题。克鲁格曼和不少的美国学者认为，人民币汇率是低估的，并且把这样一种低估看作对世界的损害。那么人民币汇率是不是低估，我今天在这里不多讨论。既 即使退一步说，中国的产品确实是靠汇率低估挤占了他国的市场，影响也是两面的。中国的出口方因为低汇率而降低了出口价格，外国的进口方和消费者是真正的获益者。从投资角度来说，中国的低估汇率还直接导致了外商对华直接投资收益弊，因为更低的人民币汇率使外国投资者在中国批租土地、支付工资和购买中间品外汇的成本更低。这也就是为什么外资大量的涌入中国这样一个原因，重要原因。因此，不应当只看到人民币汇率低估对美国生产上的竞争压力，也应该看到这对美国消费者和对华投资者所带来的巨大收益。在经济全球化的新的历史条件下，贸易、投资、跨国生产等各种形式的国际经济关系大发展，汇率绝不只是与贸易一个因素相关。换句话说，在投资全球化的世界经济当中，贸易平衡不再是衡量一个国家汇率水平是否合理的主要指标，更不是唯一指标。中国出口能力的提升主要来自于外商在华投资，外资把中国纳入了全球生产的这样的体系当中，和销售的高级的生产要素，而中国提供了加工型的简单劳动力、土地、自然资源等低端要素。外国资本流入，中国制造流出，不再是对外经济关系是非的唯一的表现。所以，如果继续以贸易平衡这样传统观念来评价，显然是不合时宜。最后，第三个问题，我们如何看中国在危机中的贡献？克鲁格曼教授说，在当前世界经济不景气的时候，中国保持了高贸易顺差，是种掠夺其他国家工作岗位的行为。在克鲁格曼看来，中国的低汇率政策和贸易顺差将使世界难以走出这个危机。实际上，这个完全是错误。在金融危机当中，2009年，中国为世界经济贡献了0.6个百分点，正的超过了新兴市场经济整体1.1个百分点的一半。中国的贡献来自于国内扩大内需的政策。克鲁格曼说，中国掠夺了美国的就业岗位。我们说这是经济全球化的结果，这是一个中长期的历史发展的过程。我们不可能要求在危机发生的时候，让中国的劳动岗位重新回到美国国内，这是不可能进行的产业结构调整。最后，我所要说的，我们不希望克鲁格曼这样的保护主义在美国真的流行起来。我们希望具有像希尔斯大使这样主张开放市场的专家能够在美国占主导地位。谢谢大家。
Now, with Ambassador Hughes or Professor Zhang Yuwen, Wu Xinbo first.
Fudan University. Thank you very much, Ambassador Hughes, for your speech. You mentioned both issues of U.S. embassy to Taiwan as well as President Obama's meeting with Dalai Lama. These are not new issues, they're old issues. But what's new is the context of U.S. China Relations, which is a deepening partnership and growing cooperation between two countries. So my question is, given the new context of U.S. China Relations, do you think whether the United States should handle the old issues in a new way that shows more respect for China and also more sensitivity to China-U.S. relations? Thank you.
It is not new. They have gone on for several decades in both instances. And the context is, the fact is that our relationship has been improving over the decades. We want to keep it improving. My point is simple. I think to continue to meet on a more regular and frequent basis would enable us to understand better the sensitivities on both sides. And there are sensitivities on both sides as to both issues. I tried to spell them out. Americans feel very strongly they made a commitment to Taiwan, not that it would stay separate. It did not address that issue. It encouraged the parties to get together. But what it did guarantee is that reunification would not be done by force. And in 1979, our Congress ordered the administration through statute to provide defensive weapons. Now, that offends the Chinese and has traditionally offended the Chinese, and our military should talk about whether or not the level of assistance of defensive weapons and the level of risk of a problem has decreased, and whether or not we can address the issue and take into account the sensitivity. But we are not talking, and that is a problem. And I think with the Dalai Lama, it comes down to values. It's a bilateral issue, but Americans are sensitive too. Americans are very sensitive about their religious opening. When the Pope comes, he doesn't get an official visit. He gets an unofficial visit, meeting with the president whether he's Catholic or not Catholic. When the Dalai Lama comes, he is recognized as a respected religious leader, not as a political leader. And we are sensitive as a people that we would not meet with a respected international religious leader. And we have a differing view on these two issues. We should talk about it and see whether we can soften it. But neither side should be angry that the other side doesn't capitulate to their view. And in families, you have differences of opinion, but you learn to live with the differences of opinion and try to build on where you have a convergence of opinion. And I think that's important, because I think we are two great nations and two great friends. And what we contribute together will be much greater than what either of us can contribute separately. And my friend mentioned we live in a globalized world. Globalized issues that we face today cannot be solved by China alone, cannot be solved by the United States alone. It will take our joint effort, and our joint effort will make our people, Chinese and Americans, more prosperous and more secure. So that's what we have to try to build, and not focus so much on the differences where our cultures, sensitivities, politics, and values drive us apart. We should understand, but we should also try to build for future harmony.
Or simply raise your question, not to give comments. Yes, with moving up here. Okay, you and you. All right.
Funny, the other day, Warren Bach from Scandic Source, and I was walking by a coffee shop, and there was some member of AmCham invited me in to sit with her, and she asked me about the Dalai Lama, and I simply said, the White House is in America. We're an independent country. We have the right to talk to whoever we want to. I think it's a matter of course, dialogue, but understanding of the system in America. For example, if the FDA rules that a medicine from China or anywhere else cannot be on the American market, the president cannot override it. If America gives asylum to a Chinese dissident, the president cannot send an imperial guard to deport that person. We have separation of powers.
You have your question or you just...
It was just a comment. And I think the understanding of the system is very important. Ambassador Hills, given America's structural economic difficulties and the high cost of maintaining a global military presence in the post-Cold War world, why is Taiwan a vital interest of the U.S.? And of what relevance is the Taiwan's Relation Act in this day when the head of the Kuomintang can freely visit China? Global military presence in the post-Cold War world. I have two questions. Number one is, why is Taiwan still a vital interest of the United States? And of what relevance is the Taiwan Relations Act to the U.S. in a day and age when you can get on a plane today and be in Taipei for supper, when the head of the KMT, the former enemy of the Communist Party, freely visits China to discuss issues with his communist counterparts. So I'm wondering if we should have a new policies for the post-Cold War world with the U.S. China relations.
I'm sorry, the acoustics were such that I didn't quite get your words, but as I understand it, your inquiry is why in this day and age, with the United States, with all of the challenges that it has, regard Taiwan as a vital interest. I think it's a question of the law that was passed, a congressional law that has the support of our Congress, and a view that we made a commitment to China and to Taiwan. We removed our recognition of Taiwan and moved it to China. There was a condition. It was a condition that was spoken in an ambiguous way, an elegant ambiguity, if you will, where China said, Taiwan is part of China. And the United States said, we know China believes that Taiwan is part of China. We understand that. But if there is an effort to unify by force, we will defend Taiwan. So negotiate, and we hope that you are able to resolve your differences. But do not do it by force. Now, is that a vital interest? It's an international commitment. If you renege on your international commitments, you lose credibility. Would we want to have a conflict across the strait? Would that add to our peace and stability in the world today? I think not. So, again, I'm not saying that I personally favor selling arms to Taiwan. If our two governments, sophisticated governments, could sit down and work out how they might have a transition. And keep in mind, as I mentioned, is not time appropriate? Is it not remarkable that the president of Taiwan is reaching out to the mainland, creating stronger economic bonds? Is it time for a propitious movement by all sides? And you're going to get there by talking.
I want to call you to here is to explain to this audience why President Obama should meet Dalai Lama and continue arm sale. This does not mean she was for this. Just want to explain to you, and may a Chinese audience may not agree with that, but we need, just because we have differences over these issues. So Carla Hughes strongly suggested we should sit together, especially we need to have two military leaders to sit together as we have had this morning a roundtable discussion. That's her intention. Let's shift a little bit from Taiwan and the Dalai Lama, if you have. Okay, so I explain to you what Ambassador Hughes' intention. Yes. Please, brief. Okay.
Sir. Barnett-Oksenberg University of California, Udon University. My question is for Professor Zhang Youwen. I'm wondering, in order to equalize the unhealthy trade balance between the U.S. and China, what's more important for increasing domestic consumption within China? Is it more important to provide better social safety nets in order to allow individuals from worrying so much about saving for the future? Or is it more important to improve the financial sector to increase consumer lending?
问题是提问者本身的观点是正确的。中国要减少对外部市场的依赖，应该扩大内需。那么其中包括建立更好的社会保障网络，使人们能够减少这个对未来的担忧。我这里所要补充的是，中国之所以更多的依靠外部市场，更多的依靠外资，一个重要原因就是中国国内投资机制不成熟，银行里有钱，企业没有能力把它变成投资，而同时却要依靠外来的投入，所以这个机制不改变，中国还可能更多的依赖外资和外部市场，所以我完全同意你的观点，谢谢。
I think it's almost time for us to conclude the yeah, right? You want? Who would like to raise their questions? And then the last one, okay. Jim Barris, yes, you.
About global economic rebalancing and all that. And is it possible, in your view, Ambassador Hughes, that if China truly end up rebalancing the economy and depend on more on internal consumption, will it be possible that by that time the outside influence on China will be diminished? Because economic relations influence the political outcome as well. Thank you.
Does not mean that China withdraws from the world. The domestic consumption in China is 35% of GDP. That's the lowest of any large developing country ever in the history. It has actually dropped over the past several years. People believe that the low deposit rates, which is where most people earn their money, is because of inflation actually losing money. And yet the interest rates afforded to large companies that export are very advantageous, so that the table is tilted against the consumer. I would think that China would benefit from a credit regime, and Professor Zhang suggested that interest rates, if interest rates were raised, the savers who are saving 50% of GDP, they would get a return. That would encourage the development of small and medium-sized enterprises and help produce the consumer market. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences has produced a report that shows that less than 20% today of small and medium-sized enterprises have access to capital. Less than 20%. And yet, the existing small and medium-sized enterprises contribute 60% to China's GDP, 50% 60% of the taxes and 80% of the jobs. When I talk to Chinese friends, they tell me we need jobs, and we need the taxes, the revenues, and we need our GDP to grow. Well then, it would seem, based upon the figures that Chinese have developed, is you want to stimulate small and medium-sized enterprises, and that could be done one way is by having more equitable credit available to savers.
Right.
Ambassador, thank you for your speech. Here, I don't want to argue with you the justification of meeting Dalai Lama or Amsel. You should or should not. I just want to, you have a second thought. Has Obama thought of the severe consequence after his two events? Could he do it better, especially after his visit, after the so high expectation of more cooperative for U.S. China relations? Thank you.
Okay, I think time is approaching the conclusion time. Actually, behind the schedule 5 minutes. As the moderator, I would like to take this opportunity to give 3 points, 3 words actually. One is, I think, a little confusion. Rebalance and globalization. How can we reach the target of rebalancing? It's a problem of how we, both great countries, to manage globalization, which when Professor Tan mentioned the globalization, made me recall the book I read by Harvard University Mr. Roy, entitled of Management of Globalization. His famous the quotation is, if I remember right, motivation of globalization is was international trade and international investment, and multinational cooperation is the vehicle of globalization. So I was a little confused. How could we manage the globalization so as to rebalance our economies? I suggest, as Ambassador Hughes did 4 or 5 years ago, as a task force. Why not China and the United States in joint force to make to organize a task force to study globalization and study on how to rebalance our world economy. This is one point is confusion. The second, I would like to advise both leaders, U.S. and China, to focus on creating and taking advantage of opportunities to build on common interests in the Asian Pacific region and as regard a member of global concerns. Actually, this is did by Mr. Richard Hess in your book, right? So this is my advice. Second point, focus on our common interests. Lastly, we are hopeful, as I'm a student of Doak and a friend as well as a friend. Whenever I participate together with Doak Barnett, by the end, he always said, I'm optimistic about U.S. China relations. But in front of optimistic, he always put one modify, cautiously. So I would like to advise here, my friend and the audience, we must be confident. We will make the relationship much better if we can bridge the differences and take advantage of the opportunities as soon as it arises. With this, I think we can conclude this meeting, and please join me in giving a big clap to Ambassador Hughes.